Hello, I'm Amy Walter, and welcome to The Odd Years. Well, as many of you know, Donald Trump is very popular in rural America. Drive down a rural stretch of road, and you're likely to see Trump flags waving in the breeze, or maybe even a Trump logo painted on the side of a barn. Rural parts of America have always been conservative-leaning, but Republicans now dominate politics there from the top of the ticket to the bottom. It wasn't that long ago that voters in a state like West Virginia sent 2 Democrats to the Senate and voted Democratic, overwhelmingly Democratic, at the top of the ticket. Heck, it was just one of a handful of states that Mike Dukakis, who got wiped out in 1988, as you may recall, won in the presidential election that year. In 2020, West Virginia voted for Trump by almost 40 points, and come 2025, the Mountaineer state will, almost assuredly, have 2 Republican senators. And while there's always been something of a country-city divide in American culture, with both sides feeling misunderstood and misrepresented by the other, the gulf between rural Americans and those in more urban areas feels deeper and bigger than ever. There have been plenty of books written about how and why Republicans, and Trump in particular, have thrived in rural America. One of the most recent is called White Rural Rage by political scientist Tom Schaller and journalist Paul Waldman. They paint a picture of rural Americans as having good reasons to be upset about the state of the country. Poor access to healthcare, diminished economic opportunities. But the authors also say that white rural Americans are more susceptible to racist beliefs, xenophobia, and are ready to reject democracy. My guests today have a different take and a different book. Dan Shea and Nick Jacobs are professors at Colby College, a place I know a little bit, go Mules, and they also happen to live in rural Maine. Their new book is called The Rural Voter, The Politics of Place and the Disuniting of America. Dan and Nick conducted 10,000 surveys of rural voters and dig into hundreds of years of voting history to try and understand the voting patterns we're seeing today, and to provide a more nuanced picture of rural voters. And that's what I wanted to talk with them about today. Hi guys, Nick, Dan, thanks for joining me today. I've been really excited to talk to you about this book, and I want to start with this question, which is, especially since 2016, there's been a lot of articles, a lot of attention paid to rural America, or at least this version of rural America, a rural America that is guys sitting around a diner who say, I really liked Donald Trump, the Democrat, and don't feel aligned with the Democratic Party anymore. So given the fact that we had a lot of attention, and there continued to be books and stories written about rural America, why did you guys want to tackle it? What wasn't being addressed that you thought you could bring to the fore?
Thank you, Amy, for having us. It's a real delight to talk to you. I think in simplest ways, what motivated Dan and I to write the book is that a lot of the insights that scholars from a variety of disciplines and methodological perspectives, that those insights were never informing the popular conversation or weren't informing it to a considerable degree. And I think some of that has to do with if I may, a bias in our, modern political analysis culture for focusing almost exclusively on quantitative measures. Now, Dan and I are quantitative scholars, and so I think a lot of the motivation for this book was to see whether or not these sociological and ethnographic accounts of rural life and rural resentment were discernible through more mainstream or maybe perceived as legitimate methods. And that's what motivated us to set on this path of doing the largest survey of rural voters ever conducted and going back and using county level voting returns since the 1800s to see whether or not this rural-urban divide is unprecedented. And in the process, I think we confirmed a lot of our colleagues and these and other, path breakers or pathfinders findings and stumbled on a few of our own.
Well, I would just add, for I think for Nick too, but I know for me it was actually a little bit personal. That is to say,
Mm.
um, we live in rural areas, and I grew up in a rural area. I grew up in Oneonta, New York, a tiny little upstate town, and my mom was a Democratic County Party chair. She was
Hmm.
the Otsego County Democratic chair, and I followed her around to the hinterlands of Otsego County to do events, and she'd meet a lot of Republicans. It was more conservative than Oneonta, the little college town, but it was very different. There was a different tone in rural America. There was a sort of, we're in it together. We might disagree on some policy stuff, but what we've seen in the last couple decades is this sharpness, this real anger, this real resentment. So for me, it's like, what the heck happened?
That's a that leads me to this question, Dan, because you're right. We've always had a country mouse, city mouse divide in this country. There's nothing new about the resentment of city people to rural people to city people. But I'm old enough to remember when there were Democratic senators in North and South Dakota, when where you guys live or a little bit north of you, rural that northern Maine, sort of rural Maine was Democratic working class union vote, pretty consistent. And it feels like almost overnight that changed. It didn't, which is what I want you guys to get into too with your research, that this didn't just happen with Donald Trump. It's been a longer trend. But what did your research show us about how that divide came to be?
That's a great question. And you're right. I can remember in 1972, my family decided to go. My dad was a prof, and we took the summer off. We went cross country camping, and we wound up in Mitchell, South Dakota in the summer of '72.
And who is from there?
Yeah, George McGovern, right? So I got to shake his hand. He happened to be there, the favorite son. So arguably one of the most left-leaning Democratic candidates ever nominated for the presidency was from Mitchell, South Dakota. Was from South Dakota, and it was throughout the United States, and think also the Upper Midwest, right? The more progressive, populous areas of Minnesota and Wisconsin and rural Michigan. So we do see this change. You are absolutely right, Amy. You're a savvy student of American history. There's always been this divide. We opened the book talking about the difference between Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson's look, and it's basically a rural versus urban issue. And throughout American history, and Nick's right, we do use data all the way back to 1824 to chart this. We see some urban and rural divides, but they tend to be regional and short term. And then we begin to see this dramatic change, this dramatic, long lasting change in 1980. In a nutshell, we spend 2 chapters talking about this. We think there are bottom up pressures and top down pressures. The bottom up are significant changes in rural America that we can't underscore the importance enough of the importance of the farm crisis in 1980. That was a transformative event in rural America. Within a decade, we moved towards NAFTA. NAFTA closed down 63,000 factories and mills and shops across the country. And the difference, Amy, that we talk about in the book is very often there's the one factory that it is the identity of the town. It is the Newton, Iowa, and Maytag. It is Millinocket, Maine, and Great Northern Paper. And when they're gone, the town is devastated. And WTO, China's admission WTO a decade later. So we have these series of changes that are really important for rural America. Now, the top down piece is that savvy Republicans, starting with Ronald Reagan and Pat Buchanan and Sarah Palin and others, convince these voters that the Democrats don't care about you. That NAFTA was bipartisan, as you know, but somehow they've been able to convince rural Americans that it is one party that has let you down, and it's the Democrats.
But how did NAFTA, you're right, it was a Democratic president, but during the farm crisis, there was a Republican president, and NAFTA was passed with essentially Republican votes. The Free Trade Party was always known as the Republican Party. So, Nick, is it that the cultural issues became more salient, or that, as Dan says, that the economic issues, Republicans were able to effectively put the blame on Democrats.
I think the latter explanation gets to more of it. And you're absolutely right. As a percentage of the party, Democrats were more opposed to the ratification of NAFTA. The negotiations for such a free trade agreement began under a Republican presidency, right? If you were to ask, maybe prior to 2016, which is the party of the free market, right? Everybody would clearly point to Republicans. That's why you can't explain the divide solely by making sense of economic changes. I mean, in part also because those economic changes, while having gross spatial inequalities, also affected many low income individuals living in big cities and middle-sized cities as well. Um, it You can only explain the political divide by also making sense of the political reaction to that. And so that's where I would also add to Dan's point about the top-down pressures of which these bottom-up economic changes that I do think, you could there's a point of infinite regress. But you can take it back prior to the 80s into the 70s and into the 60s, where again there's still bipartisan consensus on what agricultural policies we need to adopt. So like why is one party blamed? Okay, so fast forward, when Republicans are constructing a message that we are for you, real America, they are not for you, the Democrats. What is the Democrats' response? Well, in the early 2000s with Howard Dean, some Democrats said, "Let's respond. Let's compete in 50 states. Let's make sure we have a candidate in every race. Let's continue to have political desks in every community." And either because it's a new generation, or I'm willing to cede that these new technologies, the ability to fundraise at a national scale with a click on your from an email and then on your smartphone, right? All of this led to a very different understanding of how do we build party momentum election after election. It's going to be more top down. It's going to be more centralized branding. It's going to be about mobilization and not persuasion. It's going to be a more unified brand. All of these things, conversations taking place in the Democratic Party, had very tangible outcomes in terms of where resources were devoted. And it was almost exclusively to the detriment of rural outreach on behalf of the Democratic Party, which allowed this narrative to foment.
Nick, to that point, if you talk to somebody, I know you all were at a conference at the Institute of Politics where former North Dakota Democratic Senator Heidi Heitkamp is now the executive there. She was able to have a hold on a rural part of the country that had been voting pretty Republican for years, obviously voting overwhelmingly for Donald Trump. And yet I would meet, I tell her this all the time. I met a person who was in Washington, part of a coalition. I think he working with the cattle farmers or some agricultural based group. And he said, "Oh yeah, we love meeting with Heidi. She's great. She's great on our issues. She has great constituent work. Wonderful." I said, "Oh great. So you're voting for her, right?" And he goes, "No, no, I'm a Trump guy, right?" And so, how did we get to that, you guys? That you've got even in a state like or a person like Heidi Heitkamp, who you can make the argument that she did do the work and she got the credit for it, but even that doesn't seem to be the issue for a lot of these voters.
Yeah, the personal connection or the personal constituency that candidates are, able to cultivate with their constituents, with their voters in their states, right? It's becoming harder and harder to maintain in this period of nationalized politics. They are the exceptions that prove the rule, and Heidi Heitkamp, however adored she was, like was one of the exceptions, of which now there are fewer, that prove the rule. That even if you're a great representative, even if you actually articulate our issues, right, you you are still with the other, right? The one thing that a Democrat can now be in a nationalized political conversation. And in fact, the whole idea of the fact that we can even talk about a rural voter or a rural voting bloc is a function of this nationalization. That's also created an urban bloc. That's also created a educated, college educated bloc. The fact that these, pretty simple and just a handful of variables can explain people's vote choice in a country as vast and diverse as ours, I mean, is incredible. It's also a pretty recent phenomenon. Dan?
I could tell you, Amy, also what was not driving it. So one of the surprises that we found with our survey data, we wound up talking to 14,000 Americans, 10,000 of which were rural. We expected to see dramatic policy differences, right? Because these voting trends are overwhelmingly Republican. Well, surely, as we go down the list of policy alternatives, they must be far out to the right. And guess what? That's not what we found. It's not fair to say that, well, they're just more conservative than most Americans and most Republicans. That's not what's driving it. I think it is this identity, this tribalism, this connection, this nationalization that Nick's talking about. You'd be hard pressed to point to too many issues that really define rural voters. Now, there's one exception, it's fair to say, and I'll say it real quickly. We did see that on issues of gun control, rural Americans were far out to the right.
Let's just take a step back, and I want to talk about how you all defined what being rural is. Who's rural and who is not, and do people who live in rural areas, how do they make that distinction? I I'm curious too, because I see, especially in a fast growing place like where I live in Virginia, Northern Virginia, where 25 years ago, you drive 15 miles west of where I live, and it was still pretty farmy, right? And now, and now it's like suburban. There's a Panera, there's a Trader Joe's, right? It is. But I think many of the people who live there still sort of identify themselves as rural, even though by the standards of what the density of the area would suggest it's not.
Shout out to my hometown. Thanks, Amy. So the
Are
federal,
are you Loudoun County guy?
yes, yeah.
Okay, there we go.
So the federal government has about 74 definitions of rural. So let us go through each one and talk about. It's a great question, right? And some of the ironies actually in thinking about of those definitions, right? The census has a definition of rurality, and by the census definition, over half of those rural people live in what the Office of Management and Budget declares are metropolitan counties, right? You do have a lot of rural identifiers, people that say, I'm rural. In fact, I had members of my extended family that were born in the 40s in Arlington and in Alexandria that still called themselves rural, even though in no stretch of the imagination is that still a rural community. They were just sort of we had a word for them back in the day. And some of scholars, some friends of ours, Zoe Niemeyer in particular, has found that maybe a third to 40% of rural identifiers live in non-rural communities. Dan and I think we live in rural America. We do. We got some acreage. I was in the dirt this morning. We do rural things. Another one of our colleagues who was born and raised in Montana on 5,000 acres laughs at our notion of rurality. What scholars again and again and again find, though, is that when you it's like the parsimonious explanation always does the best work. When you ask people, "Hey, describe the area you live in." Like when you describe where you work, live, and play, and you give them the words rural or suburban or urban, when they say rural, in over 90% of instances, they meet one of those common definitions. And so that's the strict measurement decision that Dan and I use for the survey evidence. What is remarkable about that is that although there is tons of variation in an objective sense, population density, commute times, access to big cities, culture, even on like some regional stuff, while there's tons of variations there, the variation does not explain the politics. And that's why ruralness as an identity is being, I mean, the reason it has such force in our politics is we're seeing it at a national level. It's not rural Maine is this peculiar thing and rural Montana is this peculiar thing. It's ruralness as a national group that we identify with is on the outs, and that's the thing.
There's a difference between being a populist in the Iron Range of Minnesota
Mhm.
and being a sort of Western rural person in Arizona, right? Now those voters are voting more consistently the same.
And importantly, I'd add where that consistency really starts to show up is on the down ballot races too, where down ballot within the states where you have candidates that are allegedly, you're right, closer to the populace. We know split ticket voting's on the decline. We know vote for governor is becoming more correlated with it, but it's also in terms of the issues they're talking about, right? And all of that is becoming a part of this nationalized ruralness across the region.
Theoretically, the people who live in northern rural Maine and rural Montana are about as far from the southern border as you could possibly be. And yet, if I looked at campaign ads running in those places, immigration is probably a top issue.
Yeah, and part of it we argue in the book, it's not the whole story, but it's an important part, is the decline of local news in rural areas, the news deserts, the news holes. So, what are rural residents left with for news? And that's, of course, turning to the national news. So that's a really important part of the story, the nationalization of news. But we also find, on top of that, is that rural residents are most likely to say that all news coverage doesn't affect their lives. So when they are tuning in, they're tuning in to the national. So we get those consistent messages. The commercials look the same. You're absolutely right, Amy. And there's also this distrust of news in general. It doesn't affect me. It's not about my life. So I think that's a part of what you're saying.
Mm. Is there a different story you all think about going? I know you guys went back very, very far looking at the data, and then, of course, you have your own survey work. But thinking about rural voters in 2016, rural voters in 2020, and then looking into the 2024 election, is there something that has changed, has not? How should we be thinking about these voters differently than we did maybe 4 or 8 years ago?
Well, let me take a quick stab and I'll let Nick jump in. Something did happen between 2008 and 2010, really. So in 2008, Barack Obama does fairly well in rural America. It wasn't just the big Iowa upset, but in the general election, he does fairly well, surprises a lot of pundits with some solid numbers in rural. He doesn't win rural America, but does fairly well. But then by 2010, we see the Tea Party, we see Scott Walker. By 2012, Obama's numbers are just terrible. They're everything that he had done was gone. So the question that I've been wrestling with is what is it that led to 2016? Now it is consistent on our chart. 2016 matches exactly what you would have predicted on a linear line from 2012. But maybe something special was happening in 2016. Maybe it has to do with this desperation that rural Americans feel. As we've said before, take the anxiety that we all feel about the way our nation is going, double it and extend it back 2 decades. And that's rural America. So maybe Trump becomes the final disruptor. What do you think, Nick?
Not to be too academic, I'm still wrestling with the premise of Amy's question, right? Like, do we have a common consensus as to why rural people, again, there's lots of concentric circles. There's the white working class. There's whites without a college degree. Dan and I focus on rural people, which are smaller subsets of that larger those circles. Do we have a consensus on why rural people voted the way they do? You know, I think Dan and I are not in the consensus position. And to the extent that that's the case, I don't know if people, that have lots of more influence and power than Dan and I do, are thinking about rural voters and rural voters' place in the electorate any differently, except maybe in more harsh and unforgiving terms than they once were, although it's tough to get more harsh than the aftermath of 2016, where the epigraph was, no sympathy for the hillbilly. When we're in a world where we can sit here and think about, like, oh, well, Joe Biden gave a speech in rural Minnesota in October last year. Wow, what a difference, a single speech. Like, we're pretty far away, I think, from fully reimagining rural voters at play with different motivations that progressive and center left candidates can speak to.
Right. Your point being, it feels as if Democrats have just basically given up on them and have conceded that these people are never going to vote for us. So forget it. We're just going to go win over some more suburban voters.
Yeah, that's where the fight is, right?
Yeah.
There's that they're doomed, they're lost. They voted for that man. We can't compromise with them. There is no persuading those folks out there in the countryside that hell, they're the threat to democracy.
A quick break, and we'll be back with Dan and Nick. The Odd Years is brought to you by the Cook Political Report team. It's our way of sharing the questions we love to ask and the conversations we enjoy having behind the scenes. If you'd like to explore more of what we have to offer, consider subscribing at cookpolitical.com/subscribe. Odd Year listeners can use the discount code ODD10, that's ODD, the number 10, to save 10% on any subscription. This offer is available only to new subscribers. Dan, your point of, there are some who would say, including some who've written a book about this called Rural White Rage, that there's no mystery as what happened between 28 and 2010 is that this is their argument that rural white people said, we don't really like this black guy as president. And all that happened was resentment, racial resentment is everything. That's all that this rural white vote is. And Paul Krugman, also not exactly a conservative, but was quoting him recently, and he said, to your point, Nick, white rural rage is arguably the single greatest threat facing American democracy. You two have addressed both of those things in your own op-eds. I joked at the beginning of this that you guys have sort of a Drake, Kendrick Lamar sort of diss track going back and forth. But talk to us about that. Why isn't this just really, according to the rural white rage folks, about just pure and simple racism? And that explains everything.
Well, we don't think that's what the data finds, that the data suggests. We think that it's a complex story. It's a story that has a number of pieces, some of them unflattering for rural Americans and unflattering for all Americans. Do we find, through the traditional battery of racial resentment questions, do we find that there's racism in rural America? And the answer is yes, we do. But we also find it throughout America. We don't find it to be a majority, right? It's not by any stretch. But there are a number of confounding pieces, right? For the first is, for example, the composition effect. That is to say, is it rurality, being rural, that leads to these attitudes? Or is it a function of older white Americans more likely to be in rural areas? They're also a group more likely to hold racist attitudes, right? So there's the composition effect. And there's also this very interesting, complex connection to attitudes towards hard work. Right? We are not playing interference for racist, which we've been accused of doing. But what's interesting is that when we overlay attitudes towards hard work in rural America with these rural resentment measures, there's a tremendous connection. Now, it is fair to say that many of those attitudes about hard work as they relate to Black Americans are racial stereotypes. We're very clear about that. But at the same time, it's a complex picture. It's not as simple as racism driving this vote for Republicans up and down the ballot in rural America. I'm sure Nick has some stuff to add to that.
And to be fair, I want to hear you, Nick, and also that these are also the people who wrote this book are also taking it from a scholarly perspective, right? These are also academics.
Fair, fair. Although on this point we are discussing, I am cited in the book as confirming their evidence, and I
Hmm.
don't believe that my scholarship, what I might actually call actual research, studies I've commissioned, analysis that I've actually done, not just summarized from somebody else, demonstrates that.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, to elaborate a little bit on the racial resentment point, racial resentment, one, that's how scholars overwhelmingly look at racial attitudes in politics. It's a set of questions that have been refined over a number of years, but actually that go back to the late 80s and early 90s. My teacher, Lynn Sanders, at the University of Michigan, was at the forefront of its development. And what basically motivated Lynn's research and motivates the construction of this battery is like you just don't like you can't go out and ask people on a survey like, hey, what do you think about this group of people? Like,
Right.
hey, are you racist? No,
Right.
in fact, her contention, and I think this is debated as to whether or not it's coming back. And I think that would be an excellent scholarly project, like old school racism. I put scare quotes around that for listeners, isn't a thing anymore, right? Racism manifests in a belief that some groups are deviating from some cultural norm. And in America, in the United States, I think as true today as it was in the late 80s, early 90s, like what is the norm that people are going to be most reactive when they perceive a violation of? Hard work. So, like, embedded in the measures is this sort of conflation of racial stereotyping. This group doesn't make as much on average than white people do because they don't work hard enough, and this core value. So there's tons of debate to begin with as to whether or not you can actually extract these two, as to whether this measures just sort of conservatism, whether this is to Dan's point, whether it's picking up on a sort of belief that meritocracy still exists.
Hmm.
And that's long predicted votes for the conservative candidate, be it Donald Trump or be it Bob Dole. So it doesn't explain the trend line. It doesn't explain partisan shifts. Ultimately, what Dan and I argue is that if you actually care about combating racial stereotypes and promoting policies that would take down structural disadvantages in the economy or systems that maintain racial prejudice, you'd actually show up and try to compete and show people that the economy isn't as meritocratic as you might otherwise think, that there's a reason why certain groups in society, including lots of poor whites, are disadvantaged and can't get ahead. So that's all we try to make by showing, the people have complicated motivations, especially when it comes to race. I'll say I'm glad that we picked up on that one. On the other, I forget how many threats there are. I think there was, 16 others that were violent rednecks that were ready to storm the gates, that were anti-democratic authoritarians. That's been refuted multiple times, but just by pointing out that the evidence is wrong.
This idea of the single greatest threat to American democracy that
Yeah, that beyond the racial resentment findings again, which my work is brought in to discuss that on other aspects of the threat, again, I believe it's violence, authoritarianism.
There is another piece that I think we should talk about, and that is a particular subset of rural Americans. So Nick and I ask a number of questions about levels of engagement. How often do you post about politics online? The sources of information. How often do you get tuned into politics? And we find a group, Amy, that's about a little less than 10% that are deeply engaged. And what we did was we pulled that group out and we took a look at a whole bunch of attitudinal measures about the types of things you're talking about. And that group is off the charts. They are so extreme. We asked one, for example, we asked this question about civility. Is it okay to hurl insults at your opponents? For non deeply engaged rural Americans, it was about 20%. For the deeply engaged, it's 65%. This is the group, Amy, they're painting their barns, they're putting up multiple signs all over their yard. They are at the town hall meetings. They are vocal. They are there. This is, and unfortunately, um, coverage of this group that we call the rabble rousers, the rural rabble rousers, tends to distort our thinking about the other 90%. It is true that, and the book you're talking about, if you don't have the data yourself, if you're just grabbing percentages, top lines from other studies, you can't pull out these outliers. We're able to do that. And when we pull out this group of about 10% that are way out there, the picture looks a lot different.
And let's then talk about rural America and whiteness. Just how white is rural America? And two, is there a difference between some of those areas that are, again, rural and maybe they're Native American and rural and like in Maine?
Anywhere from about a fifth to 25% of rural Americans identify as non white or multiracial. But that's, as to your last point, not to say that every rural community is 25%, non-white. In fact, a lot of that gets
Right.
skewed by rural counties, which is often where we take these demographic figures, rural counties that might be in excess 90% African Americans, such as in the Deep South, or 85%
Right.
indigenous or Latinx in the far west. So one of the difficulties in sort of studying non-white populations in rural America is that you're looking already at a small sample of the American population, and now you're looking at an even smaller sample of that small sample. I just was pointing out to a
Yeah.
colleague of mine that on the gold standard American National Election Study done in 2020, of rural identifiers, they were able to collect 49 Black rural Americans. So our ability to do
Right.
quantitative or statistical inference to understand has been
Mm.
very limited. Now, Dan and I actually we recognize that, and the book's not called The White Rural Voter. Non-white Americans are rural Americans. They are, and we embed them in our analysis of rural America precisely because, one, we go out and because we collected, and this is primarily why we collected, thousands of respondents, right? We don't have just 49 racial minorities in our samples. We have in excess of 1,000. We can actually make generalizations, or we can make precise claims about what different subgroups of rural Americans are thinking. And I will admit, Dan's not going to like this. I will admit that in a book of 60 figures, if I could go back and put one more figure in the book, it would be the figure that Dan and I looked at for hours and said, oh, well, this is why we aren't going to call it white rural America. When you do our rural voter model, when you actually do the statistical regression that anchors our book as to what signifies rural people as rural people, whether you're Black, whether you're Latino, or whether you're white, there's the same sense of community economic anxiety. There's the same sense of social pride in being rural and social capital. The cultural precarity is not there, but that's primarily because non-white urban people feel looked down upon to similar degrees as white rural people. So it's not a distinguishing factor, but it does distinguish all of them from urban and suburban whites. And that's why, rather than just relegating them to a token chapter, oh, and this is what those people think in rural communities, right? They are a critical part of the rural voter. They don't vote the same way, though.
Right. I mean, in the Deep South, there are a number of heavily black rural counties that vote overwhelmingly Democratic. And so, again, if we're going back to the white rural rage piece, you say, well, right, so that makes our argument, right? Like, those people live in rural areas. They have reason to be upset about all these things. They're not doing and saying the kinds of things white rural Americans are doing.
If all you care about is who wins the election and not actually whether voters' concerns are being heard and problems are being addressed.
Yeah.
And that's why it is astounding that the anxieties are similar, the feeling of looking down upon is the same, the pride
Mm.
is the same. And look, you are the tea leaf reader in the conversation. And I know I've heard you talk recently, and I think correctly, about some of the unknowns about how different groups in America are trending and what the polls say, and maybe reasons to throw some cold water on these gigantic shifts. But, one thing we know is that among Latino rural Americans, which is the highest, it's the largest racial subgroup after whites in rural America, and it's the fastest growing. The gap between the Democrat and the Republican in 2020 is smaller than it is nationwide. Some evidence that we have from work drawing on 7,500 rural Americans past February shows that it's getting smaller. We also found similar stuff in our, we're still digesting, we haven't published it. So again, it's a early finding that Black rural Americans are trending in that direction. And so I think simply by making the comparison that again you didn't make, but that you shared with us,
Yeah.
you're overlooking people.
Mm-hmm.
And when you overlook people, votes can change.
Let me just add, Nick, Amy, there is also no gender gap in rural America. And also the age gap is pretty small.
That's quite remarkable.
Yep.
It's been awesome. I could talk to you guys for another hour, but let's close with this. You both live in a place close to my heart, Waterville, Maine. And first of all, I assume Waterville is not considered rural by the traditional metrics, even though I think for anybody living where I live or in an urban area would say that is rural America. Is that correct?
You are correct, with the exception, and this is how Dan and I open up the book, the politics.
Yeah.
As soon as we cross the bridges into town, like it's called Waterville for a reason, and it's the middle of the campaign season, you can see the shift from red to blue.
Like literally where you guys live, you can see the Trump flags but as soon as you get into Waterville, then it's no more Trump flags.
And all those measures that we might think would drive the rage of the rural voter, they're essentially the same. There's no real economic difference between the Vassalboro, Maine and Waterville, Maine. The schools aren't that different. The housing values aren't that. So all these measures that others might run to explain the rural voter, they're all the same between Waterville and the outskirts, but the politics is different, which picks up on the theme that we've been talking about for an hour, this identity that is the rural voter.
Nick, you grow flowers. Is that on a farm? Is that the most quote unquote rural thing you do? And then Dan, what is the most rural thing that you do?
I'd say the most rural thing I do is taking care of all the stray animals and wildlife that decides to live in my greenhouse every spring, and dumping all the stray kittens to the wonderful students at Colby College is my country quirk. Dan, I think, is going to go and search for the wildlife, which is his part. I just manage it.
Well, he's right. I do love to hunt and fish. It's a big part of our culture, my history. But Amy, I would be remiss if I didn't remind you that we make maple syrup every spring, right about the time that
Amazing.
midterms are popping up in the spring. We're out there busy topping trees. And as you might recall, our syrup makes a great maple teeny.
It's so good. And I was so skeptical of a maple teeny. Everybody out there thinks, no, it's going to be too sweet. It's not.
Good for you.
Anyway, that's a whole other story. You guys, this has been so fun. Thanks for doing this. Nick, good luck with your planting.
Thank you.
You guys got to go out and take the 5 days of nice weather you get.
Yes.
This is it. And then you get, a month and a half of great summer. And then we're back to cold and darkness.
Somehow we'll manage. Thank you so much for having us. Really appreciate it.
That was amazing. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thank you so much for listening to The Odd Years. If you liked what you heard or want to make a suggestion, leave us a review or recommend us to a friend. You're our best way to get the word out about what we do. If you want more podcasts from the Cook Political Report, consider becoming a subscriber, which gives you access to our new podcast, The Editor's Roundtable. The Odd Years is brought to you by the Cook Political Report and is produced by Becca Kaufman, Allie Flynn, and Catherine Ham. Thank you, and I'll talk to you soon.